The genesis of the Tiger, the most famous tank of the Second World War, is to be found in a number of projects for heavy tanks undertaken by the German army in the late 1920s and 1930s. However, the rapid expansion of the army after Hitler revoked the Versailles Treaty led to a concentration on the acquisition of the cheaper and more numerous light and medium tanks to equip the new Panzer divisions. It was only in May 1941 that a serious attempt to formulate a heavy tank design took place in a conference convened by Hitler, involving representatives from the armaments industry and the technical branch of the army. Hitler had been prompted by the impact on the German army of its encounter with heavily armoured French and British tanks during the invasion of France and the Low Countries in May 1940. At 32 tons, the main French tank was the Char 1B bis, which mounted both 47mm and 75mm guns with hull armour 60mm thick, rendering it invulnerable to German anti-tank weapons unless fired at point-blank range. Their experience of the British Matilda II was very similar. Although smaller than the Char 1B and weighing 26 tons, the Matilda was nevertheless even more strongly protected, disposing of 78mm of frontal armour. Although just 14 were employed in the Franco-British counterattack at Arras on Rommel's 7th Panzer Division on May the 21st, they nonetheless succeeded in penetrating the German positions, panicked infantry of the SS Totenkopf Division, and destroyed a number of Panzers before being brought to a halt by hastily deployed heavy anti-aircraft guns firing over open sights. This same experience was repeated in the Western Desert, where the British tank routed the Italians, until with the arrival of the Afrika Korps in early 1941, Rommel employed the same weapons and tactics to neutralise the Matilda's effectiveness there. In consequence of these experiences, the standard German Army 37mm anti-tank gun was found to be severely wanting, the infantry already sarcastically dubbing it the Army's door knocker. However, this weapon was also the main armament of the lightly armoured Panzer Mark III, placing it at a marked disadvantage vis-à-vis the heavy French and British tanks. Nor was the heavier calibre, but low-velocity 75mm gun of the Panzer Mark IV able to defeat the armour of the Char 1B or Matilda II. It was in the light of these considerations that Hitler ordered the rapid development of a new 45-ton heavy tank under the designation VK 4501. Primacy was to be given to the armament of a version of the 88mm Flak 18, which had proven so successful when employed as an anti-tank gun, and against which even the frontal armour of the Char 1B and Matilda was no defence. To expedite development of this new Panzer, the Henschel company was ordered to adapt its 36-ton medium tank prototype to the 45-ton heavy tank specification. This vehicle already possessed many features later seen on the production Tiger, such as torsion bar suspension and interleaved road wheels. The competing Porsche company had already built a 45-ton prototype heavy tank chassis to an independent commission awarded in 1940. The Porsche vehicle incorporated much innovative technology, which was ultimately, given the exigencies of war, to prove its undoing. Both designs were to be presented before Hitler in April 1942. In the meantime, other events were to impart a significant impetus to the heavy tank program. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched the Wehrmacht against the Soviet Union in the greatest land invasion in history. At the cutting edge of the drive eastward were the 17 Panzer divisions allocated to Army Groups North, Centre and South. These were tasked with the encirclement and destruction of the Red Army in European Russia before it had had time to withdraw into the depths of the country. While aware that they were numerically inferior in men and armour, the Germans nevertheless believed that the quality of their war machine would overwhelm the Red Army just as it had done the French the previous year. In this perception, the Germans were fatally in error, assuming Soviet military strength to be much less than it actually was. No better illustration can be offered than in their estimate of Soviet tank strength, which they had reckoned at 10,000 machines, whereas in actuality it was nearer to 24,000. Nor had German intelligence any intimation whatsoever of the existence of a new generation of Soviet tanks until they were first encountered at the end of June. The huge KV-2 Dreadnought and its stablemate, the KV-1, shared the same chassis, but carried different armament, with the former mounting a 152mm howitzer and the latter a 76mm gun. Both weighed in at around 43 tons, and their armour proved invulnerable to all German anti-tank guns. Even so, most of the 500 KVs in service at the time of the German invasion had been lost by the end of July, mainly to 88mm guns and heavy artillery firing over open sights. It was, however, the appearance of the revolutionary T-34 that had the most traumatic effect on German troops. The obvious need for a new German tank to counter these superior Soviet designs now lent even greater urgency to the heavy tank program. On the 20th of April 1942, both Tiger prototypes, each now mounting the Krupp-designed turret, carrying an 88mm gun, were displayed before Hitler at Rastenburg in East Prussia. The demonstrations of both designs were hampered by technical problems and breakdowns, and while Hitler showed a preference for the Porsche model, he turned the final selection over to a technical commission headed by Reich Minister Speer. Both tanks were now subjected to extensive comparative testing in army proving grounds. The final decision in favour of the Henschel design was dictated by its easier adaptation for production. The Porsche design was rejected because of its complex electric drive. The 90 Porsche Tigers already under construction were halted. These were then ordered converted into heavy assault guns, carrying the 88mm L-71 gun. More commonly known as Panzer Ferdinands, these first saw action in the Battle of Kursk during July 1943. The Henschel prototype, seen here testing the snorkel attachment for deep wading, was formally adopted for production. Contracts were issued for the new heavy tank under the designation Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger E. The German public received a glimpse of the new heavy Panzer being assembled on the production line of Henschel & Son at Kassel when Deutsche Wochenschau carried a general propaganda feature praising the increased output of tanks by the armaments industry in July 1943. Although a highly effective fighting machine, the small number of 1,350 Tigers produced between July 1942 and August 1944 reflected the complexity of its design and unsuitability for mass production. In the final section of this footage, the 8th Tiger of the 50 produced in May 1943 is seen emerging from the assembly shop, still in its primer coat of red oxide, and awaiting the base coat of sand yellow paint already applied to the machine that follows it. The small number of Tigers built precluded their incorporation into the Panzer divisions. The Army thus raised 10 heavy tank battalions, numbering them from 501 through to 510, each comprising of 3 companies totaling 45 Tigers when at full strength. Only the elite army divisions Großdeutschland and Panzerlehr received their own organic Tiger battalions. The 1st, 2nd and 3rd SS divisions also received Tiger companies, these later being expanded into full battalions within these divisions and later still employed as independent formations within the SS Panzer Corps. At the time of its introduction, the Tiger was the most powerfully armed and heavily protected tank in the world. No tank could withstand the firepower of its 88mm gun, which could penetrate 100mm of armour at over a mile. In the course of production, modifications were incorporated into the design, which led to the appearance of 3 basic models. The primary distinguishing features of the earliest, seen here, being the drum-type cupola and 2 Bosch headlamps located on the top of the hull front. In July 1943, the mid-production model introduced a new cast cupola. A single Bosch headlamp was now placed between the machine gun housing and the driver's visor. The Tiger is also covered with Zimmerit, a paste applied in a rippled fashion to vertical surfaces and designed to prevent the attachment of Soviet magnetic mines. In February 1944, the final model of the Tiger I introduced the same steel road wheels employed on the Tiger II, which had recently entered parallel production at the Henschel works. The combat debut of the Tiger was hardly auspicious. On Hitler's orders, 4 Tigers were committed to battle in totally unsuitable conditions near Leningrad in August 1942. 3 were knocked out but later recovered. The Russians, however, did not capture their first Tiger until January 1943. The first combat footage of the Tiger was taken in March 1943, in service with the SS Panzer Corps during the German counteroffensive in southern Russia. The Western Allies first encountered the Tiger in Tunisia, where the heavy tank battalions 501 and 504 were destroyed in fighting there. On June the 26th, just prior to the Kursk offensive, Field Marshal von Manstein, commander of Army Group South, hosted a visit by a 5-man Turkish military delegation led by the Chief of Staff, Colonel General Jahit Toydemir. The Turks showed particular interest in the Tiger tank provided by the 3rd Company of Heavy Tank Battalion 503 as it was put through its paces, crossing a wide anti-tank ditch. They then inspected the latest examples of German military technology. They were particularly impressed by the high-speed run of the Tiger and observed the heavy tank firing at distant targets. Such visits were all part of a determined but ultimately forlorn attempt by Hitler to woo the Turks and bring them into the war on Germany's side. On July 5, 1943, Operation Citadel, the last great German offensive in the east, opened in southern Russia. The German objective was to destroy the huge Soviet salient centered on the city of Kursk and destroy the enemy forces therein. Their aim thereby? To draw the teeth of Soviet offensive power for the coming summer, thus freeing up panzer divisions for transfer to the west to counter the expected Allied landings in southern Europe following the collapse of the Axis position in Tunisia. To achieve this end, Hitler had concentrated immense German strength, particularly in mobile forces, so as to force a rapid victory. The 2,700 panzers and assault guns to be employed constituted no less than 60% of the total tank stock of the German field army, rebuilt with such efforts since Stalingrad. As such, these vehicles were irreplaceable. German industry could not make good such losses again. Much turned on this offensive. Indeed, Hitler stated that its success would shine forth as a beacon, a signal to all who had now begun to doubt a German victory in the war. Whereas the Germans may well have succeeded had the offensive been launched in the spring, as had originally been intended, the delays Hitler foisted upon his generals allowed the Soviets to transform the salient into a huge fortress by high summer. Hitler, however, was absolutely convinced that the Russians would collapse in the face of concentrated assaults, led by large numbers of his new Tiger and Panther tanks and Ferdinand assault guns. Indeed, Kursk marked the greatest concentration of Tigers ever assembled for one operation. No fewer than 56 Tigers were available to spearhead the southern thrust of the 4th Panzer Army in its allotted task of breaking through the Soviet defences of the Voronezh front and advancing on Kursk. The Grossdeutschland division employed a company of 14 Tigers, with the other 42 distributed among the 3 Panzer Grenadier divisions of the SS Panzer Corps. Flank cover for the advancing 4th Panzer Army was provided by Army Detachment Kempf, which had been allocated Heavy Tank Battalion 503, which was at full strength with 45 Tigers. However, the 3 Tiger companies of 503 were split up to serve with the 6th, 7th and 19th Panzer Divisions. In the north of the salient, 9th Army had been allocated Heavy Tank Battalion 505. This unit was as yet unblooded in combat and had only the first 2 companies, with 31 Tigers on hand at the start of the offensive, but was joined by the 3rd Company on the battlefield on the 9th of July. The vast Soviet minefields led to the destruction of many German tanks, and in this sequence the cameraman flying over the battlefield has caught a Tiger repairing a track blown off by a Soviet mine. The heavy Ferdinand assault guns of Tank Hunting Battalions 653 and 654 successfully broke through the Soviet positions on the first day of the offensive, their long-barreled 88mm L-71 cannons executing great damage to Soviet armour. However, once enmeshed in the Soviet defences, their lack of a machine gun for self-defence made them highly vulnerable to infantry with magnetic mines. The crews then had no choice but to employ their main guns to take pot shots at the infantry, quail shooting with cannon, as General Guderian described it, for their own self-protection. This accounts for the 44 Ferdinands lost against a total of 89 committed to the battle. Even so, it is clear that they were very effective tank destroyers. On August the 6th, a Wehrmacht communiqué reported that the two battalions had destroyed 502 Soviet tanks between the 6th and the 27th of July. The Soviets placed great store by the destruction of the Ferdinands, appreciating that they were a prestige weapon to the Germans. The Tiger was without doubt the most effective killer of Soviet armour at Kursk. The low, rolling terrain of the battlefield allowed it to do great execution at long range to the T-34s, KV-1s, Churchills, Lees and T-70s that made up the bulk of Soviet armour in the battle. Individual Soviet tankers who recall duelling with the Tiger draw attention to its very effective long-range gun and heavy armour combination. They spoke with consternation at the way their 76mm shells simply bounced off the frontal armour of the beast. It is not surprising that T-34 commanders were advised to employ their speed and faster turret to traverse, to both close and manoeuvre their charges so as to hit the Tiger in the flank where its armour was thinner and penetrable. Such was the Soviet tactic at the climactic Battle of Prokhorovka on July the 12th, when the 5th Guards Tank Army clashed with the SS Panzer Corps in the greatest head-to-head armoured confrontation in history. On a very constricted battlefield, the 500 T-34s of the Soviet forward echelon rushed at the advancing German armour, so negating the range advantage of the Tigers. There began a huge armoured melee in which the gun reach and armour thickness counted for little, as tanks blew each other apart at point-blank range or rammed one another, leading to detonations that shook the battlefield. Although Tiger losses at Kursk were light, just 33 being destroyed on all fronts during July, the battle was nevertheless lost, and with it, the military initiative on the Eastern Front. It was a measure of Soviet respect for the German heavy tank that the Pravda headline, "The Tigers are burning," became synonymous with the Red Army's victory in one of the decisive battles of the Second World War. Little thought had been given as to how the Tiger could be recovered when broken down. Normal procedure was to employ 3 18-ton half-tracks, as seen here, to tow the 56-ton machine. However, over 2 days in May 1944, Heavy Tank Battalion 508 lost 15 Tigers due to mechanical breakdown and the lack of recovery vehicles. In the aftermath of Kursk, the Tiger battalions fought hard as the German front was pushed back to the river Dnieper. By the late autumn, the surviving Ferdinands of Panzer Jaeger Regiment 656 were involved in heavy fighting at the Nikopol bridgehead in the Dnieper Bend. The Wehrmacht communiqué of the 26th of November stated that the Ferdinand had accounted for 56 Soviet tanks in the very heavy fighting there. After this battle, the surviving Ferdinands were pulled out of the line and then returned to Germany for rebuilding. They subsequently received a secondary machine gun, a commander's cupola and Zimmerit. The improved vehicle was renamed the Elefant. These were then dispatched to Italy, where they were finally lost through attrition. In November and December 1943, the Tiger Company of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandart Adolf Hitler, was involved in heavy defensive fighting in the Kiev area. Evidence that the appearance of the Tiger on the battlefield could have an impact out of all proportion to the small numbers actually employed is well illustrated by the role of Heavy Tank Battalion 502 in the fierce battles in northern Russia at this time. The battalion had been fighting around Naval and were absent when the Red Army launched its great offensive out of the Iranian-bound bridgehead, designed to finally break the German siege of Leningrad in January 1944. However, the rapid transport of 502 to the battlefield allowed the Tigers to help extricate the German forces in the face of heavy fighting and assist Army Group North begin its retreat from the city. Transport of new Tigers to the front and movement of individual companies and even of whole battalions was carried out by rail where possible. No easy task with a tank as wide and as heavy as the Tiger. Special, narrower transport tracks were fitted to reduce its width, with the wider combat tracks stored for the journey. The whole process of changing tracks and removing the outer road wheels for the journey Then placing them back again on arrival at the destination was laborious, but increasingly frequent as Tiger units were shifted around the Eastern Front as fire brigades to help deal with Soviet breakthroughs. The speed with which tracks could be replaced was obviously affected by weather and other conditions, but an experienced crew could see the whole task through in about 30 minutes. Movement of Tiger units demanded much planning, since they required the use of rail cars that could accommodate their weight. These had to be specially constructed for the heavy Panzer, as the Deutsche Reichsbahn possessed no flat cars that could accommodate 56 tons. As those built were stressed to 82 tons, they were also employed to carry the Ferdinand, Tiger II, and subsequently the Jagdtiger. During a winter and spring of alternating deep freeze and rapid thaw, Army Group South was exposed to a series of massive Soviet offensives, during which Tiger units were continually in action. For the German Lancer, the war in the east now became a continuous succession of hastily constructed foxholes, either scooped out of the glutinous mud or blown out of the frozen earth. A temporary resting place, a defensive point set up to defy, but rarely halt, the westward advance of the seemingly inexhaustible and irresistible Red Army. Although German forces continued to secure local tactical victories, in the wider strategic context, the Red Army totally held the upper hand. German resources were simply no longer adequate to cope with the might of the Soviet Army. Massive Soviet production of tanks and self-propelled guns, together with the benefit gained from the lorries and other equipment supplied by the Allies through Lend-Lease, led to a new appreciation by the German soldier of the full reality of the Soviet steamroller. In late January 1943, a major Soviet offensive in the northwest of the Ukraine broke through the German lines, leading to the encirclement of 60,000 German troops around the town of Cherkasy. The Germans moved quickly to assemble a relief force, led by Panzer Group Becker, an armoured battle group comprising the Tigers of Heavy Tank Battalion 503 and the Leibstandart, and supported by Panthers and other Panzers. They launched their attack towards the pocket in early February, but progress was slow in the face of heavy Soviet resistance. The Soviets were absolutely determined to prevent the German relief force from breaking through to the pocket, viewing the destruction of such a large number of German troops and their equipment as a major coup. In consequence, German tank losses were high, notwithstanding that they claimed the destruction of 210 Soviet tanks in the fighting. After a fortnight's slow and ponderous advance, the Germans finally punched a corridor through to the pocket on February the 17th. However, only 30,000 men could be saved, and all heavy equipment had to be abandoned to the Russians. When reflecting on the course and outcome of this battle, Becker observed that of the tanks in his battle group, the Tiger was the best and had been particularly effective in the heavy fighting with Soviet armour. In early December 1943, the resurrected Heavy Tank Battalion 503 arrived at Vitebsk in central Russia. With a full complement of 45 Tigers, it went into action against the Red Army and was involved in heavy fighting throughout the winter. Although it sustained heavy losses, it received only a few replacement Tigers before the onset of the Soviet summer offensive in June 1944. This next sequence shown in German cinemas during April 1944, shows the Tigers of Heavy Tank Battalion 505 in action near Tarnopol in Romania. It is of particular interest in that it is possibly the best surviving combat footage showing tactics used by Tigers in combat. Having dropped off the grenadiers who will follow up the advancing armour, the Tigers move forward against the unseen Soviet positions. They advance in pairs, offering mutual support and employing the standard fire and movement drill learnt in their tactical training. The footage also serves to demonstrate how, when operating in nearly optimum conditions, the long reach of the 88mm gun could penetrate a T-34 turret out to 3,000 metres. It took until the spring of 1944 for the Red Army to field an upgraded version of the T-34, equipped with a new turret and gun that could take on the Tiger with a degree of success. The 85mm ZIS S-53 gun was a potent weapon, and its effectiveness was enhanced by its being mounted in a new three-man turret that for the first time divested the T-34 tank commander of the need to double up as an assistant to the gunner. However, the Tiger still retained the ability to kill a T-34-85 at ranges beyond which the Soviet tank could reply. It was as a defensive weapon that the Tiger found its forte in the battles of 1944 and 1945. Taking advantage of cover and stealth, it was able to exert a very high price from advancing T-34s, as is witnessed by the litter of their blackened hulks, filmed with such relish by the propaganda company cameraman for the Deutsche Wochenschau. However, in the JS-2, the Tiger was faced with an altogether more potent adversary. With a turret armour 160mm thick and mounting a 122mm gun, which fired a 25kg shell that could penetrate 160mm of armour at 1,000 metres, this was the machine with which the Red Army hoped to neutralise the Tiger. General Hasso von Manteuffel spoke of his first encounter with the JS-2 in the spring of 1944 when commanding the Grossdeutschland Panzer Division. He said, "It came as a shock to find that although my Tigers began to hit them at 2,200 metres, our shells did not penetrate them until we had closed to half that distance. But I was able to counter their technical superiority by manoeuvre and mobility in making best use of the ground." These tactics were employed by Tiger crews on both the Western and Eastern fronts until the end of the war. On the 23rd of June 1944, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration, a massive offensive which all but destroyed Army Group Centre and inflicted upon the German Army the greatest defeat in its history. By the end of July, the Red Army had been propelled to the borders of Poland and East Prussia. In those 2 months, 216 Tigers were lost on the Eastern Front, and Tank Battalions 501 and 505 all but destroyed in the Soviet maelstrom. Nevertheless, the surviving Tigers continued to offer heavy resistance to the advancing Soviets, and the presence of the heavy Panzers was greatly appreciated by the German infantry, who could nearly always rely upon the firepower of the Tiger to blunt most Russian assaults. In the long run, those Tigers bottled up in Lithuania were slowly ground down over the winter and spring of 1944 and 45 in heavy and ferocious battles with the Red Army. It was in the late summer of 1944 that the only variant on the Tiger I chassis first saw service in Poland. Weighing 65 tons, the Sturmtiger had been designed in response to a demand from the Army for a powerfully armed and strongly protected assault vehicle. The heart of the machine lay in its 380mm rocket launcher, housed in a massive armoured superstructure. They were built by the Elefant factory of Berlin and equipped 2 companies. The first of these was dispatched to assist in the suppression of the Polish Home Army in the Warsaw Uprising in August. The Sturmtiger joined other special-purpose vehicles, such as the Karl Mortar, in seeking to fulfill Hitler's demand that Warsaw be levelled. Warsaw was the most appropriate blooding for the Sturmtiger, as it was for this type of warfare it had been designed. far as is known, this is the only extant footage of the Sturmtiger in action. The film has been deliberately slowed down to allow the 345 kilogram rocket projectile to be seen leaving the barrel of the mortar. A number of Sturmtigers were encountered in combat by the US Army in December 1944 and January 1945 on the German border. Most were captured, although 3 survived through to March, and having been ferried across the Rhine, found final employment in action around the city of Bonn until their ammunition gave out. On June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord, the long-awaited Allied invasion of Europe, took place with landings along the Normandy coast, which achieved almost complete surprise everywhere. This had been assured, above all else, by the overwhelming but erroneous conviction of the Germans, and reinforced by the Allies with continuing disinformation, that the real landings would take place in the Pas-de-Calais. With the bulk of the German armours stationed away from the coast, the limited forces available to attack the Allied bridgehead could do little to realise Rommel's demand that the invasion be halted on the beaches. On D-Day itself, only the 21st Panzer Division moved ineffectually against the British and Canadian landing beaches north of Caen. By the end of the 6th of June, the Allies already had over 500 tanks and 150,000 men ashore. On the 7th of June, the 12th SS Panzer Division arrived and attacked the Canadian 3rd Division. In the ensuing battle, captured on this footage, the Germans succeeded in knocking out 28 Shermans for the loss of 6 Panzer IVs. Although there were some 88 Tigers stationed in France at this time, none were yet in action. At the time of the invasion, the SS Heavy Tank Battalion 101 was stationed in the Beauvais area to the north of Paris. Although ordered to Normandy on the 7th, the battalion only arrived to take up position in the vicinity of Villers-Bocage on the 12th. Coincidentally, the British 7th Armoured Division had launched an attack designed to swing it on a southeasterly axis through Villers-Bocage into the western flank of the German forces, blocking the northern approaches to Caen. Early on the morning of the 13th, a column of the leading elements of the British division had entered the village. They had been observed by Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, commander of the 2nd Company of the SS Tiger Battalion, who now moved out to engage the column in his vehicle. The scene was now set for one of the most remarkable tank actions of the conflict. Wittmann was given command of his first Tiger in early 1943 when serving in the 13th Company of the SS Panzer Regiment 1. In Russia, he served in all major battles on the southern front, and by January the 9th, 1944, his tally of destroyed tanks stood at 66. On the 14th of that month, he was awarded the Knight's Cross. A fortnight later, having raised his tally to 117 tanks, he was awarded the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross. In April, he took command of the 2nd Company of the 101st SS Tiger Battalion. He was a fated and well-known figure to the German public by the time of the Normandy campaign. Breaking from the cover of trees, Wittmann drove his Tiger along the drawn-up column of British tanks, lorries, half-tracks and Bren gun carriers, shooting them up before entering Villers-Bocage, where he proceeded to dispatch a number of Cromwell tanks. He was now receiving fire support from the other 4 Tigers of his company, and was shortly joined thereafter by others from the 1st Company. The footage shot after the battle gives a graphic impression of the event. Lining the western entrance to the village is a column of burnt-out M3 half-tracks bearing the 7th Armoured Division insignia. A little further on, the Stuart light tank is caught lying astride the main road into the village. Knocked out Cromwells are seen in the main street, victims of Wittmann's Tiger. Further along the main street is a Panzer IV lying alongside a Tiger, both destroyed by British infantry. Wittmann's own Tiger is seen here, abandoned by its crew when its track was shot off. In reward, Wittmann was promoted and awarded Oak Leaves with swords to the Knight's Cross. Although the Tiger had already acquired a fearsome reputation prior to the Normandy campaign, it now became an object of dread to Allied tankers. The manner in which the German heavy panzers could take out Allied tanks, seemingly at their leisure, almost led to a political scandal in the United Kingdom. The most numerous Allied tank was the American-built Sherman, which in its most common form was equipped with a short-barreled 75mm gun and had a maximum armour thickness of 50mm. A Tiger could penetrate the turret armour of an M4A2 Sherman at 1800 metres, whereas the Sherman could not even reciprocate at virtually point-blank range. Even when the Americans introduced the longer-barreled 76mm gun on their M4A1s, they were profoundly disappointed to discover that they would still have to close to 700 metres to penetrate the turret armour of the Tiger, which could still defeat them at 1800 metres. Nevertheless, it was a Sherman modified by the British and carrying a 17-pounder gun and named Firefly that provided the Allies with the only tank able to kill a Tiger at combat ranges. Nor did other Allied tanks fare any better. Even the Churchill's Mark 7 and 8, which had frontal armour of 152mm, could not withstand the power of the Tiger's 88mm gun. The new Cromwell was as badly off as the Sherman. German newsreels of the fighting in Normandy are replete in their coverage of destroyed Allied armour. Shermans, Cromwells, carriers and other machines are paraded by the propaganda company in mute testimony to the purported superiority of German arms. However, the cameraman has caught 2 destroyed Sherman Fireflies. Issued on the basis of 1 per troop of 4 Shermans, they were quite naturally the main target of any Tiger commander. Allied tank losses, though high, could always be made good from their vast reserves, whereas every Tiger lost in Normandy could not be replaced. And lost they were, if not always to Allied tanks, then to other means which included the overwhelming firepower directed onto German positions from heavy naval guns on vessels lying off the coast. Allied warships logged shells up to 16-inch caliber many miles inland. One German officer recalled how heavy guns from the battleships were devastating. When one of these shells dropped near a Tiger, the 56-ton tank was blown over on its side just from the blast. If the Germans had no answer to such firepower, they were also as impotent to protect themselves against the overwhelming Allied air superiority over the Normandy battlefield, notwithstanding the immense numbers of light and heavy flak guns they deployed to protect their ground forces. For many German tank crews, including those from the Tiger battalions, used to the fighting conditions in Russia, where air power played a secondary role, the experience of Normandy was overwhelming. New disciplines were rapidly acquired. There was the constant need for one of the crew to scan the skies and warn of the appearance of the dreaded yabos. They had to become proficient in decking out their panzers with all manner of foliage, so as to disguise their movement from the air, and when in position in woods and in hedgerows, for the provision of effective camouflage became quite literally a matter of life and death. One of the most hated weapons was the Hawker Typhoon fighter bomber, which shortly after D-Day was based in large numbers on hastily constructed airfields within the Allied lodgement. Being so close to the front line, they were able to respond very quickly to calls for close air support. Apart from their inbuilt armament of 4 20mm cannons, their principal and most destructive weapon were 8 60-pound unguided rocket projectiles mounted under wing and which carried a punch equal to the broadside of a light cruiser. Even the Tiger could not withstand such firepower when on the receiving end of a Typhoon's attentions. On July the 18th, Operation Goodwood opened with a massive raid by over 1,000 heavy bombers on German positions covering the Caen-Falaise road. Their principal target were the Tigers and 88mm guns that could dominate the flat land, across which Montgomery now intended to launch 3 armoured divisions. Many of the lighter panzers were buried. One Tiger of 503 was flipped over, 3 others destroyed, and many others rendered temporarily hors de combat. Even so, the The subsequent German response indicated enough guns and panzers had survived to exact a very high cost from the oncoming British armour, now manoeuvring on the broad plain. Taking advantage of the great range of their guns, the Tigers, Panthers and other panzers methodically shot up the advancing British armour, so that by day's end, one regimental historian was later to write, out of the great array of armour that had moved forward to battle that morning, 106 tanks now lay crippled in the cornfields. After a further 2 days' heavy fighting, total British tank loss had risen to 400, or 36% of their total armoured strength in Normandy. However, German losses too had been high, and whereas the vast Allied reserves allowed virtually every tank lost to be replaced in 36 hours, for the lost panzers there were none. It was becoming all too apparent to many senior German commanders that the rate of attrition in Normandy, in both men and machines, was now so high that the fate of the Army of the West was no longer in doubt. Operational at the time of Goodwood were the first Tiger IIs to see combat, 12 serving with the 1st Company of Heavy Tank Battalion 503. With an all-up weight of 68 tons, the Tiger II was the largest and heaviest tank of the Second World War. Although designated Tiger B, the new heavy Panzer was more akin in appearance to an enlarged Panther medium tank, sharing essentially the same configuration of sloping armoured plates. The heart of this design was the immensely powerful 88mm KWK 43 gun of 71 calibers length, which remained the most effective weapon fitted to any tank of this period. The 88mm L71 was a variant adapted for the Tiger II of the Pak 43 heavy anti-tank gun that had seen service with the Army since 1943. Many of these weapons were mounted, as seen in this footage of the weapon in action, on an extemporized split-trail chassis, making it heavy and cumbersome to move. It was nonetheless capable of destroying a T-34 at 3,500 meters. The Tiger II was issued only to the heavy tank battalions of the Army and Waffen-SS, most of these re-equipping when the Tiger I ceased production in August, and more frequently because of the great losses among the heavy tank battalions on the eastern and western fronts during this period. None of those serving with 1 Battalion 503 survived the Normandy campaign. The breakout of American forces from the western sector of the Allied lodgement and the drive by Patton's Third Army across the rear of the German position opened up the prospect of the destruction of the Army of the West through encirclement. On the 8th of August, an Anglo-Canadian offensive was launched to drive through to Falaise and so provide the northern arm of the pincer. Massive Allied firepower was deployed on the ground and in the air to break the German defences. One of the German casualties was Michael Wittmann and his crew, killed on the 8th, his Tiger 007 being destroyed by the combined fire of 5 Shermans, although other sources state that Typhoons were responsible. Wittmann's body and those of his crew were rapidly interred near their destroyed tank and were only recovered in 1983, where they were finally buried in a German war cemetery in Normandy. The Allied pincers did not finally close around Falaise until August the 18th. In the meantime, 100,000 German troops escaped the encirclement. Destruction in the pocket was colossal. Allied aircraft and artillery pounding the roads carrying the retreating German troops. The surviving Tigers fought on to the end, only a few escaping the great destruction in the pocket. Total German casualties in the Normandy campaign amounted to over 450,000 men killed and wounded and 1,500 tanks destroyed. For those who escaped, there now began the Rückmarsch, the retreat east and northeastwards across France. German cameramen were on hand to record the progress of the escapees through French villages on their way to the River Seine. The surviving panzers that pressed on towards the river crossings were harried all the way by roving Allied fighter bombers. In consequence, the roads to the river were littered with destroyed and broken down tanks, now abandoned by their crews, who made their way eastwards on foot. One of the few Tiger IIs to survive the pocket was lost in this way. As Allied aircraft had destroyed all the heavy weight-bearing bridges, the only equipment to make it to the east bank of the Seine were light vehicles taken across on rafts or able to cross the pontoon bridges constructed by the engineers. For those crews that had nursed their tanks to the river, as in the case of this Tiger I, belonging to the 2nd Company of Heavy Tank Battalion 503, their efforts were to be in vain. With no ferries able to bear the weight of a Tiger, or suitable bridge to hand, they had no choice but to blow up their tanks to prevent them falling into enemy hands. Thus, as the Allies followed in the wake of the retreating Germans, they were confronted by huge piles of burnt and destroyed equipment. This Tiger, having survived Normandy, ended its days as a wreck on the dockside in the port of Rouen. One of the more famous sequences of German armour from the late war period shows the re-equipped Heavy Tank Battalion 503 on parade for the benefit of the camera. Indeed, this footage was the German public's initial glimpse of the tank that the commentator named for the first time as Königstiger, or King Tiger. The survivors of 503 had been relocated to Sennelager in Germany in early September 1944, and over the next month the battalion received its full complement of 45 Tiger IIs. These all mounted the later Henschel turret. The curved front plate of the earlier turret, originally manufactured by Krupp for the aborted Porsche submission for the Tiger II, had proven to be an excellent shot trap and was discontinued. The newer design was not only easier to produce, but offered better protection to the turret crew. Shortly after this film was taken, the whole battalion received orders to entrain and were then moved post-haste to Hungary in early October. The initial task of 503, upon reaching Budapest, was to ensure that the Hungarian government did not carry out a ceasefire with the Soviets, who were even then advancing upon the city. For a number of days, the Tigers patrolled the streets of the capital, providing a deterrent to those who wished to break their links with Germany. It just so happened that the stills then taken provide some excellent close-up shots of the Tiger II and allow a fuller examination of a number of its features. This still is dominated by the huge Sowkopf or boar's head mantlet that held the very long barrel of the 88mm gun. The small frontal area of the turret offered a very limited target, while the massive glacis, composed of 150mm armour, sloped at 50 degrees, was virtually invulnerable to enemy fire. The presence of Zimmerit on this Tiger II shows that it was constructed before the 9th of September, when a decision was taken to discontinue applying it to Panzers. Thereafter, Battalion 503 was employed fighting the advancing Red Army. Although the battalion put up heavy resistance, in the course of which it notched up its 1500th enemy tank, by early November it was fighting on the approaches to Budapest. It later participated in the German counterattack at Stolweisenberg. In early January 1945, 503 was renamed Feldernahler, its former number allocated to an SS Tiger battalion. It was involved in heavy fighting in the east until May 1945. Heavy Tank Battalion 506 had employed Tiger Is on the Eastern Front from July 1943 until ordered back to Germany to refit with the Tiger II in August of 1944. Its first combat operation with the new heavy Panzer came a month later in Holland, where it was employed to help crush the Allied attempt to secure a bridge across the Rhine by paratroop assault at Arnhem. The Tiger IIs went into action around Oosterbeek. With the failure of Operation Market Garden, the battalion was sent south to oppose the US drive and subsequent assault on the city of Aachen, which resulted in fierce and bloody fighting which lasted through until the end of October. At the end of November, the 3rd Company registered its claims for the period of operation with the Tiger II as 222 tanks, 189 anti-tank guns, 24 guns and 32 trucks destroyed. Thereafter, the battalion was earmarked for the Ardennes offensive. Contrary to the popular misconception, few King Tigers were employed by the Germans in their Ardennes offensive, otherwise known as the Battle of the Bulge, when launched on December 16, 1944. Only the SS Heavy Tank Battalion 501 and Army Heavy Tank Battalion 506 were actually employed. In the case of the former unit, which was attached to the Leibstandarte during the offensive, the decision was taken not to employ them at the point of the advance because of the problems caused by their width and heavy weight on the narrow icy roads. Nor were they employed as a unit, rather they were used piecemeal in street fighting and in the forests. In the offensive, Battalion 506 was used in the assault on Malmedy and served in the battle for Bastogne and were engaged in heavy fighting into January. A number of the Tiger IIs were abandoned by their crews when their fuel ran out, while others were destroyed by Allied fighter bombers or successfully stalked by US tank destroyers. The SS Heavy Tank Battalion 501 was later to report that during combat operations in the Battle of the Bulge, it had lost a total of 13 King Tigers. One of the rarer vehicles employed by the Germans in the offensive, and later abandoned, was an early Tiger I belonging to Panzer Abteilung 301. This was a Funklenk, or command tank for 3 Borgward B4 tracked demolition vehicles of a similar type seen earlier in this video in the footage of the Warsaw Uprising. As the Allies advanced into Germany, the last great natural defensive barrier was the Rhine. This, however, was breached in early March when the US Army discovered to its immense good fortune that the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was still standing. A bridgehead was rapidly established on the far side and became a priority target for the Germans. Thrown into action against it on March the 12th were Jagdtigers of Jagdtiger Battalion 512, although it had seen limited service with Battalion 653 in the Ardennes. This massive fighting vehicle, weighing 70 tons, was designed to carry the 128mm Pak 44, the most powerful anti-tank gun of the war. Although encountered in the Allied drive through Germany, the small number of 77 built meant that it had a negligible impact on the fighting. It was at 0500 hours on April 16, 1945, that the final Soviet offensive opened in the east, with a barrage from over 8,000 guns and rocket launchers by the forces under the command of Marshal Georgy Zhukov. It took them 3 days to storm the Stalar Heights, which were heavily defended by the Germans with 88mm guns, armour, and the King Tigers of SS Heavy Tank Battalion 502. Even to the last, the Tiger crews continued to exert a disproportionate loss rate on the enemy. Zhukov, under intense pressure from Stalin, hurled wave after wave of T-34s, supported by JS-2s and assault guns at the German positions. While many of these tanks were reduced to hulks by the long rifles of the Tigers, the German units were finally ground down and then overwhelmed by the Soviet juggernaut. Berlin was completely encircled by the 25th of April, and a very bitter battle began amid the streets and rubble of the city. The Soviets moved in medium and heavy armour, and by the 30th, the Soviet 150th Division had fought its way to the Reichstag, which was heavily defended by die-hard German troops. Even while other Soviet troops took on the fanatical Volkssturm and Hitler Youth fighting in the lower levels of the building, a small group fought its way upwards to the roof. At 22:50 hours, the red flag was unfurled to fly above the Reichstag in symbolic triumph of the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany. Hitler was already dead. It was not until the 2nd of May that all German resistance finally ended with the surrender of Berlin. With a production run of fewer than 2,000 Tiger Is and Tiger IIs built, these heavy panzers generated a formidable reputation among their enemies. In 3 years of operations, the heavy tank battalions of the Army and Waffen-SS took a very high toll of Allied armour. If there was one weapon which could be said to have delayed the defeat of the German army on the battlefields of Europe, then it was the Tiger tank.